Thank you. Okay, so I guess we're ready to go. Okay, can everybody see my screens?
Looks good.
Good. Okay, so I've titled the talk "Getting from Here to There," and the discussion relates how to, not us getting from here to there, but getting a container or a piece of cargo from here to there. Okay, so I am an attorney in Philadelphia. I've practiced principally in New York City for 17 years, and then I moved to Philadelphia. And my practice is largely related to international trade of goods. So I've been dealing with some of these issues, frankly, my entire career. This is, I think, I'm beginning my 50th year. So Jim hit some of the statistics that we're talking about. We're now up to over $2 trillion in goods enter the United States annually. And these goods require that somebody declare them, to tell the customs what they are and how much they're valued at, among a lot of other things. And I'll take you through that in a couple of minutes. And while there are a lot of numbers about customs duties paid, one number I want you to concentrate on is, you've all probably heard, I'm sure you're all familiar with the dispute we've had with China related to what's known as intellectual property disputes, among other things. Lawyers call it a 301 dispute. It happens just to be the section of law that allows our government to act. And since that dispute has begun with China, we've collected $95 billion worth of punitive tariffs against China, Chinese goods, just since that dispute has begun. Most people would be a little bit surprised by this, but if I said to you, think in your own mind what you think the average rate of duty is on goods that come into the United States, I would say that the majority of you would say, well, it's somewhere between probably 7 and 15%. And the fact is that the average rate of duty on merchandise coming into the United States now is between 1 and 2%. We do not collect a lot of federal revenues on a comparative basis from customs duties. But I don't mean to diminish that. I think it is third. I think it's personal and corporate taxes, of course, are 1. I think estate taxes are 2, and customs duties is 3. So it's pretty high up there. But so these are the numbers. We have 11 million containers arrive by sea. 11 million containers come into the United States by truck. That's largely Canadian, principally Mexican, and of course a lot come in by truck from Canada. Many of those from Canada that come in are actually goods from, say, Asia that land in the Western Canada ports and then arrive by truck, say, to Seattle. And then 2.7 million containers arrive by rail. And $1 trillion in goods arrive by air. So the watershed moment in how we manage cargo in this country and what we learn about cargo in this country, of course, came on 9/11. And shortly after 9/11, there was a bit of a lag time between the attacks themselves and when we began to focus on the risks we were facing and what we didn't know about the facts about the movement of commercial cargo. That happened in September of 2001, of course. And for most of 2000 and the balance of 2001, we were dealing with the movement of terrorists. How did they get in? We were talking about the incident itself. But by about 2002, the government really began to focus on where our risks were. And international traffic in goods was very, very high up on the list. And I remember listening to a congressional debate in which one congressman talked to a panel of government high-level executives were before the member of the committee, and one of the committee members said, why don't we just open up every single container and examine every box in every container? And when I heard that question, it struck me as to how little that person knew about how cargo moves in this country, that we couldn't do that for 1 month. And I think there is only one country in the world that has a policy of examining every container that comes in, and it's one of the African countries, Namibia or Zambia, I forget, but it's just sort of about a 17th century consideration. We're just too far advanced from it. You cannot ever examine every container of goods that comes in by land, sea, or truck. So I want to sort of give you a example from my experiences of how things radically changed after the 2001 attacks. I had a small case in Portland, Maine. The company was served with an administrative subpoena, and the government was looking to determine whether they may have underpaid customs duties. And it was beginning under the anti-fraud provisions. It wasn't simply administrative. It was a case that began under the anti-fraud statutes. So of course, a company is concerned about it, but I get a fair number of those cases, and you can pretty well determine whether a company has serious problems or whether it's a manageable problem. And in this case, I pretty much concluded that this was largely a dispute over whether something is dutiable at 6% or 16%. But for this company, it was a fair amount of money, maybe $250,000. But the company was served with their subpoena. It's called a summons in this area of law. And I gathered all the data, got all the documents together, analyzed them. And it's the kind of thing where you look for an email, and does the email say, I have an idea, at which point everybody knows that there's a problem, or does the email traffic indicate that there's just commercial decisions? And that's all there was in that case. I wasn't too worried. I gathered all the documents together and I sent them to the special agent in Portland, Maine. And that was about July or August of 2001. And I was expecting to hear back from him. And generally what happens in those cases is the agent calls you and he says, why don't you come on up to Portland? Let's have a discussion and how we can resolve this. September came and I didn't hear anything from the agent. October came, I didn't hear anything from the agent. November came and I didn't hear anything from the agent. So I called him and I said to him, I was expecting to hear from you. And I'm an ex-FBI agent, so most of the agents that I have worked with over the years, they talk very plainly with me. And when I said to him, I was expecting that I'd hear from you. This is a nothing case. I'm sure you figured that out by now. And what he said to me really shocked me. He said to me, John, I'll tell you where the documents are. They're in the corner of my office, unopened. I haven't seen them. I haven't spent 5 minutes on them yet. And he said, I'll be honest with you, John, if you're not representing a terrorist or a money launderer, we don't care. And that was a surprise. I mean, particularly as a lawyer, where you look to the landscape and you say, what is the business out there? He was saying, in effect, if you're just representing ordinary corporations, the government momentum has changed we're not going to get around to you for a long time. And in fact, in that case, I think about 3 years later, I settled the case. But that was the period of time in which the government basically said, we're going to change everything about what we think is important about cargo. And in 2 other cases I had, and what was surprising about these cases was how almost identical cases they were. They both arose out of conduct at the Port of New York, and they both arose around something you see fairly regularly. And that is, you get a man who is let's say a Pakistani resident. He comes to a Pakistani citizen. He comes to the United States to get a job, and he leaves his family back in Pakistan. So he's got a wife and 6 kids home in Pakistan. Comes to the United States to earn money, and his whole goal and objective is to send money back to keep his family surviving in a country like Pakistan. And that's fairly common. And in 2000, but what happens in those cases is that both because of their experience in Pakistan and their fear of the unknowns in the United States, they just will not, when they leave the United States, they will not tell the government that they're carrying on them $300,000 or $400,000. Because what they do is, if a man is going back to Pakistan to see his family, he will reach out to the Pakistani community in the United States from the village from which he came in Pakistan. And he'll say, I'm going back to Pakistan. And his friends from that village will give him $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000. And they'll say to him, bring it to my family, give it to my family. So these men, when they go back to Pakistan, they'll leave for a month, but they'll have on them $300,000 or $400,000, in which they're giving, they're collecting it from other people, and they're giving it to other families when they get to Pakistan. As you all know, the law says if you leave the United States with more than $10,000, you have to declare it. Prior to the terrorist attacks, it was simply a violation of law to fail to declare. And in 2000, I represented this guy. He did not tell customs he had a lot of money. They found $400,000 on him. He was bringing it to about 65 families. And he came to me and he said, can you help me get my money back? And I remember in that case, I spent about 40 hours of time, and I got him, I think, about 85 to 90% of his money back. It was not a big deal. Come the 2001 attacks, in around 2003, I had a young man come to me and he said virtually the same thing. I was going back to my village. I reached out to all my friends who come from the same village. They all came to me and said, we want you to bring money back to my wife. I collected from about 50 men in the United States. I collected about $400,000. I packed it in a suitcase. I left Kennedy Airport and I was stopped. In that case, that man was going to Pakistan with one other colleague. 2 of them were going back. They were both arrested. They were both charged with a new crime that had come out of the USA Patriot Act, which was called the offensive. It was called bulk cash smuggling. So there was a new statute had been passed after the terrorist attacks that made it a felony to export money or to import money and not to declare it. Still not an offense to export or import cash. It is now a federal felony to fail to declare it. In that case, it was about the same amount of money, and I think I spent about $250,000 worth of my time to get those guys their money back. I lost it. It's a kind of case that you really don't take for, you don't look to make a lot of money on this case. You do it because those guys were absolutely at sea. They didn't have anybody, nobody knew the rules that could help them. But I ended up having to, in effect, represent about 50 different men. And the Justice Department took the case over. In the first case, Customs took the case over. Customs handled it administratively. The Justice Department said, nope, we're filing actions against all 50 of these seizures in the federal district court. And it was a hugely complicated case. So those are just two examples of how the landscape just changed overnight in this area of law. So before 2001, what are the as it relates to the movement of cargo, what are the kinds of issues that arose in the either criminal or almost always in the quasi-criminal conduct? First is that goods are falsely classified. Merchandise comes in and the product is dutiable if it's wearing apparel of cotton, it's dutiable at 26%. And somebody classifies it as wearing apparel of silk, which is dutiable at 5%. And so there can be a substantial amount of duties that are underpaid in that kind of a dispute. Or goods are falsely valued. I represented a guy who brought in computer chips, and the chips were valued at about between $1 and $5 a chip. And what he did was to say that they were defective chips, and he was bringing them into the United States to repair them. They weren't defective at all. They were fine. He was valuing them at 10 cents a unit. They were really worth between $1 and $5 a unit. That's the kind of case you had pre-9/11. And then you had cases like a statement of that might not have lost anybody any money. But in one case I had, for example, an article was imported into the United States, but it was declared to be a product of France when it was a product of Pakistan. The rate of duty is the same. The values declared were truthful. And you'd look at that and you'd say, well, what is the benefit? If you're not paying less duty, what is the benefit of calling something a product of France when it's a product of Pakistan? Well, the product happened to be a medical device. In fact, it was surgical instruments. And at that time, and probably still is today, many hospitals would not buy medical instruments that were manufactured in Pakistan because they tended to be inferior quality. So there was a perceived risk of higher incidence of medical malpractice if you bought a product from Pakistan. So a hospital would send out a bid and it would say, we're looking for forceps, scalpels, etc. No Pakistani product eligible. So what this guy was doing was manufacturing. In fact, he was manufacturing very high quality medical devices. They were very good, high quality product. We took them to several surgeons and they said, this is as good as anything you'll find in Germany. We couldn't sell them. And so you had that kind of a violation pre-9/11. And then the final one was goods that are entered by what are known as an unfair trade practice. That is, they're dumped into the United States at a competitively low price. Nobody goes to jail. It's only a duty assessment case. Those are the kinds of cases we were dealing with. What are the cases you've got now? Cases we have now are the first thing is everything that existed pre 9/11 exists now post 9/11. So you have all of those issues. But now we've got a variety of other issues. One is human trafficking, and that comes in two forms. One, literally the movement of human beings, the smuggling of human beings from a foreign country into the United States. Mexico, sometimes they're put in containers and put in cargo containers and they come into the United States. Human trafficking is a big problem, or a growing problem. But there's a second problem in human trafficking, and that relates to the making of goods in a foreign country by human trafficking. And then there is a federal law in place that prohibits the importation of goods into the United States that are made by victims of human trafficking. And the law was changed. I won't go into too much about how the law was changed and why it was changed. But the law prior to about 4 or 5 years ago was fairly easy to get around. Congress changed that law, and now it's a much more serious offense. So that's a problem that comes up now. We didn't see it in before 2001. Of course, you've still got the concerns of bioterrorism and terroristic activity. You know, the great fear of a bomb in a container. Shortly after the 2001 attacks, I think we all remember it was a big issue here in Philadelphia because the cargo was entered in Philadelphia and there was a container load of grapes from Chile and they were tainted with a deadly chemical. And, you know, that was the Customs Service worst nightmare. You get a shipment of product and it just gets tainted at the source, and everybody is victimized from it. That's a product of 2001. Counterfeiting of goods has arisen exponentially in the last 10 or 15 years. Counterfeit sneakers, counterfeit rings. There was a seizure 2 days ago in a fairly obscure port. I think it was St. Louis. They found a company that had smuggled 65 counterfeit sports championship rings. So counterfeit NFL Super Bowl championship rings, counterfeit Major League Baseball championship rings. And that was a fairly, the value of the cargo seized was in excess of $800,000. Bulk cash smuggling, I've talked about. And what is now a growing concern is what's called corporate identity theft. And that is closely linked to the offense of counterfeiting. And one of the concerns that the government has in the international movement of counterfeit goods is that in the United States and in the foreign countries, China particularly, counterfeiting is the domain of organized crime. And in the United States, it's becoming more and more the domain of organized crime. And counterfeiting of goods is linked arm in arm with corporate identity theft. And what do I mean by this? Assume you are Dow Chemical Company. You know that you've got a shipment of chemicals coming in. There's somebody in a logistics department who knows that there's a shipment of chemical 1 coming into New York the first week in January, a shipment of chemical 2 that's coming into Miami in the second week of January, a shipment into Houston on the third week of January, et cetera. So somebody is charged in a company like Dow Chemical with following the product that it owns that's coming in. What Dow Chemical may not know is that someone has gotten information related to Dow Chemical's entry information, and it's making entry in Dow Chemical's name of a product that Dow Chemical will never see. And what is that article? It's a container of counterfeit sneakers, for example. And how did it happen? It happened because somebody was taking Dow Chemical's name and using the name on paperwork, but intercepting the shipment from the point at arrival until the point that it got to where it would have gone if it were really Dow Chemical's product, and sells it into the United States. And there's it would take up too much of my time here to explain how that happens. But functionally, the principal problem is that there is someone charged with clearing the goods from the point where they arrive in the United States until the point that they arrive to the importer's door. And if that person is compromised, that's where you're likely to have an experience of corporate identity theft. The government's getting more sophisticated in identifying who are the persons in the logistics chain who can likely steal an identity of a corporation. And they're identifying them, and they're getting them, and they're punishing them. And then what Customs is also doing is, for example, if they find that it is a counterfeit container of Nike sneakers, they're notifying Nike. Nike takes a look at the product. It confirms that it's not its product. And then Nike institutes suit against everybody that it's identified in the corporate chain. And these guys can find themselves on the back end of some really serious lawsuits from companies that are having their goods counterfeited. Okay, so what changed after 9/11? Principally, the first issue that changed after 9/11 was that the government began to look at importers and said, there used to be a division of responsibilities. The importer would do this, and the government would do this. And you do your job, and we'll do our job, and the law will be sufficiently protected, and the cargo will be sufficiently protected. And after 9/11, the Treasury Department, Customs Service, and then as it emerged, the Department of Homeland Security concluded the government is taking on more responsibility than it's capable of managing, and we have to shift a lot of these responsibilities back to the importer. And they revisited a doctrine that's been around since about 1985. It's called the doctrine of reasonable care. And that is, what do we ask an importer to do to ensure that the goods that it orders are in fact the goods that are coming in? So the standard of what was a breach of reasonable care was elevated substantially. So in analyzing this standard of breach of the standard of reasonable care, the government really broke it down into two areas. Number one, what are the risks we have as to the movement of cargo? And number two, what are the risks that we are facing with compliance in law generally? So the government not only said we have to do more to ensure that if a container arrives, it's not at high risk of having a bomb in that container, but we now want to increase the obligation of the importing companies to know what the country of origin is. For example, a company in the United States can easily place an order with a company in Vietnam and say we want to buy sneakers. from your company. What is the level of comfort that the company in New York has that's placed the order with the company in Vietnam to ensure itself that that order isn't subcontracted out to China, over which the United States didn't know it and can't investigate it if it is not aware of that change in origin. So that really gets to how a corporate compliance department is run, which is different from a concern you'd have in a container of cargo. So and this is all the dialogue that was going on in 2003, 2004, 2005. How do we get our arms around this? A couple of facts. I used to teach law, and I would very often tell my students, I would say to my students, what is the percentage of goods that you think come into the United States that is imported by a company that is related by stock ownership or by family to the foreign seller? Kids used to say 15%, 20%. In fact, the number is about 87%. 87% of the products that come into the United States by a company importing are somehow related to the company that sells. GM buys from GM in China. Volkswagen of America buys from Volkswagen Work AG. BMW buys from BMW AG. 80% of the goods flow in that form of route. So if you can get your arms around the companies that have relationships with the foreign sellers, you've covered 87% of the landscape. That's by volume, by value. And the second statistic that I check them regularly, 79% of the merchandise that comes into the United States comes in from 15 countries. So if you can get your arms around the corporations who are buying from related entities and the corporations that have the countries that have the high traffic into the United States, you've really begun to get your arms around high risk. The value that Customs saw about that was not that they got their arms, they never really were concerned about whether there was going to be a serious violation of law when BMW buys from BMW. What they wanted to do was to free themselves of the time that they were spending on those companies, so they could spend 85% of their time on the 15% of the other irregular transactions. So the first thing that Customs realized that it needed to do was to get a much better arm around data. And they needed to accelerate the time in which the data was going to be delivered. It served the government and they learned this pretty fast, it served the government no value to realize that an article that they were told was manufactured in Vietnam was really manufactured in China if they learned about it 45 days after the container arrived. They couldn't stop it. That's a bell you can't unring. And the other thing they needed to do was increase the importer's knowledge of its customer. If the customer didn't know that the Vietnamese manufacturer of footwear was placing the order with a third party, there was less of a likelihood that a violation was going to be detected. The fourth thing that they needed to do was align import and export data. Import data was managed by US Customs and Department of Treasury, Department of Homeland Security. Export data was managed by the Department of Commerce. So you basically had parallel data, but it's being managed by two very different agencies. So as it relates to cargo, Customs started a program, and it was called the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, within a profession known as CTPAT. And they sat down with with the major manufacturers. They begin, of course, with about the 85-15 rule. They sit down with them, the major manufacturers, and they say, in effect, you guys have to give us a lot more data. You got to give us it more timely. And you in the United States have to develop a much greater level of comfort that the cargo containers that are coming in are secure. So we now have a variety of sort of forms of exams, and I'll go through them again. But now have what's known as a commercial targeting center, so that it's in, I think, Virginia. Customs can take a product that it's got an interest in and target the arrival of that product anywhere in the United States and say, we want that product is to be examined, whatever port of entry. Now, I asked somebody, Paul, can we throw up on the screen now the
yes,
exhibit?
Joel will do that.
Joel? Okay, so this is what you have here, is just sort of a standard customs declaration. But look at the amount of data that's on this document. It tells you the name of the name of the carrier that's bringing the product in. It gives you a bill of lading number. It tells you the voyage number of the product. It tells you where, if you look at box number 13, it's got an identification number of the manufacturer of the goods, right down to the plant. It's not that it's manufactured by Dow. It's not that it's manufactured by Dow in Belgium. It's that it's manufactured by Dow in Belgium in their plant on Main Street in Ghent, for example. So, and it's also got the name of the importer, and it's got the name of the person to whom the importer is going to buy. It's got information as to the country of origin of the goods. It tells you where the product was laden aboard the vessel. That can become very important. If you feel that you've got a breach that occurred in Lahore, in Pakistan, you may not know who the breaching, the high-risk entity is, but you now can send out a direction that everything on this vessel arriving in every single port in the United States that was laden aboard vessels in Lahore is to be more carefully examined, for example. And all that data exists. To give you an example of how sophisticated this can get, and I want to give you an example of how sophisticated this now has become. I've represented a couple of companies that are traders in scrap metal, but of course, expensive scrap metal. You probably really can't create a market in importing used steel, but you can create a market in importing used molybdenum, tantalum, vanadium, all of these articles that are scrap, but very expensive product in their virgin state. And I represented a company who was importing scrap molybdenum. And he said to me, I just got a notice from custom, and scrap generally is imported duty-free. And there's a reason for it, but we won't take up too much time. Scrap is imported duty-free. Pure molybdenum may be dutiable at 10%. So, okay, can we go back now to the good. So Um, if you've brought in $3 million worth of scrap molybdenum and Customs thinks it is virgin molybdenum, the difference in a single shipment is $300,000. And that would have been a shipment on the small side. So one day my client gets a notice that this scrap molybdenum that he brought in, and he had been bringing, he does not deal in virgin product. He is a sophisticated scrap dealer. The product that he had brought in was classified as virgin molybdenum, and he owed the government $300,000. So and they also said, and by the way, we're opening a proceeding under an investigation under the anti-fraud statute. You don't tell the government that you might have underpaid $300,000 without them saying, we got to look at this pretty seriously. So I was balancing on one hand the opening of an anti-fraud investigation and a simple assessment in which the client said, this stuff is scrap, I've been importing it for years. Why is it all of a sudden called virgin materials? And as I worked further with the government, here's what I learned, is that their data collection had become so sophisticated that they were comparing the price of scrap against the price in markets in the United States of virgin material, all of which they were getting from the Department of Commerce. And what happened in that case was that there was a huge spike in the increase of scrap molybdenum. It just within about a 2-week period became very expensive. The price of virgin molybdenum went up also, but it went up to a lesser degree. So when this client brought in scrap material that he valued at, say, $3 million, 6 months prior to that, that scrap material might have been worth $11.5 million. The value of the product had doubled. And the customs computer systems picked it up and said, that is probably not a shipment of scrap. It's a shipment of virgin product. It's dutiable at 10%. This guy's trying to evade. So I eventually prevailed in the case because what I did was to deliver to the government a whole a sheath of literature bemoaning within the industry the increase in uncontrolled increase in the price of scrap product. And I was able to trace my client's earlier shipments at a lower rate to the increase in molybdenum and my client's later shipments at a higher rate at about the scrap price. And eventually the government backed off and they said to me, okay, we're not going to further proceed. We're closing the anti-fraud investigation. We're not going to assess the duties. You're fine. But I remember sitting down with the government and saying, just tell me how this happened. And they said, our data systems picked it up. We compared scrap prices with virgin prices, and you were closer to virgin prices. I said, what was it? And they said, it might have been 2 weeks. And I said, that was all the difference in the world. The price of scrap material has gone up that fast. Okay, so we're now back to this issue of called the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. What did the government undertake to try to get a better handle on cargo and whether any container coming into the United States was at risk? And what they basically said was this. Number one, I may want to. Okay, I'm going to go just fast forward about 3. The first thing the government said is, we're now going to require a deep dive, both in the foreign country and in the United States, of risk. And we've got to do something to make it attractive for the companies to engage in this partnership that we're dealing, called the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. What do we do with a company to say, if you engage in the deep dive that we're going to require of you, it will serve you better when you come to the United States? And they identified about 3 things that were meaningful. 1, they said, we will reduce the number of examinations your company will undergo. Any trafficker in cargo internationally will tell you that cargo examinations cost lots of money. And if you can reduce cargo examinations, you're saving an importer money. The second is, they said, if you sign up in our program that allows a deeper dive in cargo coming in overseas, we will work out an arrangement with Canada in which your goods in the United States going into Canada will get faster access to the Canadian market. It's called the FAST system. And the third thing they promised them was that if we do examine your cargo, you will get what they call front of the line priority. So if there are 15 cargo containers that have been set for examination and you're a member of CTPAT, your container goes to the front of the line. Those were the 3 things that the companies, that the government promised the importers that they would get if they signed up. Why? Because they knew that when they were asking these companies to sign these partnership agreements, number 1, they're not mandated as a matter of law. We'll get to that in a little while. And number 2, they're tremendously expensive. You basically have to start a compliance department, and they can become very expensive. Government knew all of that, and they said, okay, what do we do on the other side that they can measure a savings? And those were the 3 things that were offered. So okay, well, what were the risks? Basically, what our government said, in the international movement of goods by sea, by cargo, a risk begins at about the factory door. So that when a cargo is moving from a warehouse or a factory, either a factory warehouse or a commercial warehouse, onto a truck, there's a risk there. So the first question became, what do we know about the people who are loading these articles into containers? The fact was, I didn't know anything about them. So the American companies, to sign on to CTPAT, had to enter into contracts with their suppliers, that the suppliers, for example, would do criminal background checks on everyone who works in a warehouse who is managing cargo that will be put into a container that will be sent into the United States. We had to know whether some of these guys had terrorist leanings, whether they were ex-convicts, and you had to get the buy-in from the producer overseas that they would conduct those searches. Then you had to get the buy-in from the marine carriers. Let's go one back. So you now have done some kind of a record search on the people at the factory who are loading boxes into a container, and you're now satisfied. We know who they are. They're our employees. We manage who gets the job of loading the containers, and we make relatively sure that those aren't people who are a risk to us. The next thing was, how about the truck that moves the container from the factory to the port? What do we know about them? You knew nothing about these guys. Is there a system by which a truck, when moving from a factory in Helsinki, Finland, to the port, if it is diverted, the company will know about it? How do you set up that system? And the American buyer had to look to his supplier in the foreign country and say, not only do you have to manage your factory personnel, you now have to manage your transit subcontractors or your contractors. You've got to assure us that the trucks that they use, for example, are sophisticated enough that there's a GPS system on them, so that if they are diverted, we'll know about it. That became a project. Then you got to the longshoremen in the United States. When a cargo is unladen in the US, how do we know that the guys who unload those vessels, that they're not somehow compromised? And not overnight. I mean, it took a long time, but there is now something that is called a TWIC card. And that in the United States is called a transport workers identification card. And you only get that if there has been a background check done on you by the stevedoring company that's going to put you on the pier. So you can see the government now identifies these risk points, and they just begin to close them one by one. And they say that if you sign up with us and you make requirements of your carriers, make requirements of your foreign transit workers, make requirements of your factory people, we'll give you better treatment on the front end when it comes into the United States. What all of that became, you guys and gals are in business, you all know what that is. It goes down to basically one phrase. It's all cost benefit analysis. How much is it going to cost me to sign up with this program with the government? And how much money am I going to save by the promises that I'll get reduced examinations when the cargo comes in, or movement to the front line of the line, the front of the line, if in fact my cargo is examined? And that became the great question within corporate America is, do we sign up to this program that's going to cost us $3 to $5 million? And are we going to get $3 to $5 million worth of savings in expediting cargo release once the cargo comes in? Became the entire analysis. Always remember Donald Rumsfeld's comments about the unknown unknowns, because when all of this, people began spending the money, they began getting the releases, they began to study them, and only last month there was a comprehensive study done. I'll get to it toward the end of this, about the effectiveness of these programs. And you saw corporations looking at it in a manner that was beyond corporate cost benefit analyses. That frankly, certainly, because I was advised all the time, should we enter this program? Should we not? Here's what it's going to cost us: $3 to $5 million to sign up to CTPAT. Do we do it? And I've been in 20 of those conversations. Okay, so now we've talked about the movement of cargo. How about the movement of others, the just improved assurance that the government wants when they say, if you told us that these goods came from Vietnam, it's duty free if it's from Vietnam, it's dutiable at 35% if it's from China, you're going to give us documents. How do you guys know in your compliance department that there's not a second supplier in there? Or how do you know if you say that this product is dutiable at 10%, how sure are you that the government would agree that it's dutiable at 10% and not 20%? What are you doing to ensure sort of the monetary aspects of the movement of these goods? And they had a second program that was called the importer self-assessment. So what does a company do within the company itself, setting cargo aside to make sure all these other things are being done, that we're not buying goods that someone else owns a trademark to, that we're not buying goods that someone else has a patent to, that we're not in a situation where a widget is described one way if it comes into Los Angeles and a different way if it comes into New York. That became...
Excuse me, John. I think we better call 5 minutes right now, so we'll have some time for Q&A.
Okay, so those were the two programs. They were up, they were running, they're now running, and they have been running. And as we all know, it's everybody keep our fingers crossed. While, of course, violations continue, we've not had a serious terroristic event in the United States. So, about a year ago, Customs went out and hired an independent consultant. This was a study group out of the University of Houston. And they said to them, and they got to that exact core, if everyone in the United States is doing cost-benefit analyses on this program, you now go back to the participants in the program and ask them whether they're satisfied that there's a benefit to this that exceeds what we in Customs know is a very significant cost. And what they found was quite something. First, 50% of the participants in these programs said that the benefits outweigh the costs. 30% said that the benefits were about the same as the cost. So same as or better, 80%. And that the benefits varied by segments. Cargo by sea, a little more popular than cargo by air. Cargo by truck, much more popular than the others. And very few of them said that if they were given the opportunity to back out of the problem, that they would back out. Why? Here were the variables that were not taken into consideration in the end, at the beginning of the program, that now companies looked at. Number one, companies were seen as more trusted suppliers by their customers. So if you were an importer of chemicals and you're selling to a customer in the United States, and your program, you're part of this CTPAT program, your customer in the United States said, I now know that since my distributor from Finland is in this program, there's a less likelihood that my goods are going to be tied up and at customs. So the importer who was part of the program says, I've now got more confidence by my customer. Foreign governments began to repeat them. Europe now has a similar program, which means that it's now more easily able of translating this to other countries. It was seen by senior management of the publicly traded companies as a recognition of good corporate citizenship. And that was seen as an enhancement of brand development. None of those were the unknown unknowns when this began. So the bottom line is these programs that I was about 50-50 when companies were asking me whether we should sign on. Why? Because I didn't focus on the unknown unknowns. It now appears that there's quite a bit of value to these programs. So they're getting more valuable, they're working. We've got these, the data is being a lot of data that used to be required when the goods arrived is now being transmitted to the government when the carrier leaves the foreign port. So they're getting this data faster. They can do more with it. And basically, that's why these programs have largely been successful in the United States, and they're being replicated by most of the foreign countries throughout the world. So the program is working. Okay. That's about it. Am I okay on time?
We do want to have Q&A, so if this is a good place to cut. Now, let me say, first of all, I have my hand up too, so I'll just say this is a fabulous talk. It's so fascinating, and I really feel bad you have a lot of numbered slides we never got to, and I just wish we could have more time with you. Maybe we could set that up sometime. But anyway.
I told Paul yesterday, I taught for 25 years. 25 years. I would go into every single class and I don't have enough material. I'd say I don't have enough material to get through a 2-hour lecture. Yeah. Well, I go through every single lecture and I'd never have enough time.
You have so much important material in your head and you express it so well. So anyway, first questioner is Bill Tittle.
Okay. Yeah, John, thank you very much. I think that trade is so important. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Bill.
Yes.
Good. Trade is so important to lower the cost of goods for everybody. But there is a real concern. I don't care, frankly, about the money side, because the consumer will decide what he buys based on the economics to him. But I am really concerned about quality and, of course, the terrorism business. I mean, we have enough people in the United States that are, ill and, want to hurt people, much less in the whole world. Right. So I think this is a good system, but here's my question. I was in the chemical business. So Dow imports into the United States from Dow China. Mm-hmm. Now, Dow China is majority owned by the Chinese government.
Right.
So if we ever get to a point where, there's this political desire to hurt people or whatever, aren't we in trouble with regard to that process? Because Dow Chemical or Dow China could be a vehicle for damaged goods or whatever.
Paul, we are there. We are there because one of the statistics that I showed you was the amount of money in what are known as retaliatory tariffs that are being imposed on Chinese goods. And the reason they are being imposed on Chinese goods is there was an investigation that began about 2017, very shortly after President Trump came in. And he said, I want to know whether there are policies by the Chinese government that infect our ability to buy and sell, even if from related entities. That investigation was undertaken, and the report came back. It was undertaken by an agency called the U.S. Trade Representative. Trade Representative reported that in fact it was, that some of these rules, for example, Chinese government owns Dow Chemical China. Chinese government steals chemical formulae and then uses it to make establish a different factory outside the Dow framework. And the government, and that is a violation of international law. It is a violation. We found that it exists in large measure. That formed the basis of us saying we're going to quantify the damage that's been done, and we imposed 25% duties on about 75% of the product coming out of China. The numbers are all over the place. That happens, and it's already started. The response by the United States, and I don't want to be political, but for most of my career, I've represented foreign entities that are importing into the United States, or American companies that are buying from foreign entities. But the retaliatory actions we have taken are legitimate under US law, and they're legitimate under international law. Where we have failed is that we have not been able to get the Europeans to sign on to the same response, even though they have exactly the same complaints. And that was the difference in style between the two administrations. Trump said, I'm not going to listen, and I'm not getting political on it. I just tell you how it happened. Trump said, I'm going to make these decisions, and I'm not going to have anybody in Europe tell me I shouldn't. So we went it alone. And the Biden administration is saying this will become more effective if we can get Europe to sign on. And he's in those kinds of negotiations to see whether you can get Europe to sign on to the same method of retaliation that we have. And we, of course, we don't yet know how it's going to happen. But that concern that you've raised is right at our doorstep.
Thank you, John.
So at this point, it's 11:30, nominally the end of the meeting. But if you have a little more time, John, we could continue this for another 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah,
as long as there are questions. I think this is really valuable. So Walt Meissner, you're next.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. It's kind of like ISO 9000 that's used for manufacturing to trace every step of the manufacturing process,
right,
and applying it to trade and imports and exports. Now, in a way, you've sort of alluded a little bit to the question I had, but my question was, what do the European countries do individually and collectively, and also what do China and Russia do to, for the same types of issues for imports into their countries?
Well, yeah, there is, and it's in my screen. The United States took the lead in developing these programs, obviously, because of how badly we were hurt in 9/11. But as Europe saw it develop successfully, they modeled it. So they've come up with, because they have their own terrorist concerns. So now what's happening is this. European nations develop their own their own systems of watching cargo. And they now adopt a program of another country. So if you're a company if you're like Dow Chemical, and you are approved for CT-PAT in the United States, that approval can get translated into Europe as meeting the European standards for cargo containerized protection. And they're called different names. And I've actually got the European program name on one of those slides. I think in the UK it's called Green Lane. In the EU has a name. Japan now has one. Korea now has one. And so what happens is we're now going government to government memorandum of understanding. The United States will accept the Korean program for container security. Japan accepts the US. So it's taken on a life of its own, which is fairly successful.
And so what did Russia and China do?
I don't know of one with China because there are so many political overtones to that.
Great, thanks. Mitch, you're next.
Yeah, hey, John, thank you. And you hit the nail on the head with respect to the cost benefit issues. And in my way of looking at it, it's also a frictional issue, reducing the friction through the whole process. And quite frankly, it's amazing that anybody tries to move anything internationally, given the complexity of it all. And when I was working for DHS 4 or 5 years ago, one of the issues that came up was the opioids, and that's an incredibly high value, low mass import, and the illegal imports of those things can be done in UPS and FedEx mailers, and you just about, and USPS particularly, and you just about can't find it in the whole needle and haystack problem. But it's just amazing that we control anything in this business, and of course it's and thanks to you to doing all this stuff. I just want your perspective on how do we reduce the friction in all of this stuff. I know we've done a lot with electronic manifestos and so forth that used to be all manual, and there's no longer checks at the Canadian border, for instance. But what's your perspective on how we continue to reduce the friction?
Well, you mean how you reduce risk?
Risk, and also just the administrative burden of moving everything.
Yeah, well, the first thing you have to do is you've got to give an incentive to a company to undertake these costs. And in the beginning, everybody was looking at this as saying, because you can chart that if a container is marked for examination, a sophisticated company like Dow or DHS or any of these companies, they can tell you pretty well how much that's going to cost. It's going to delay it for 3 days. You have to hire a cartman to transfer it from the port to a designated warehouse. You've got to hire somebody who's going to open the container. And so it's going to cost you $2,000 to $3,000. Once a container is marked for identification, it's going to cost you $3,000. I represented a company a couple of weeks ago that did a study for me, and they were having every single container from Pakistan, from a certain factory, marked for what they call intensive examination. It costs $4,000 to $5,000 for each container. And the CEO called me and he said, John, that's my profit. That's my profit. So the first thing you've got to do is get everybody to understand that if they sign on, they'll save those costs. But then you have to have some level of dialogue with the government. For example, in that case, I wrote the government, what I call the Center for Excellence, and I said to them, you guys have now examined 19 containers from the same country, originating from the same factory. You found nothing, and it's cost my client $150,000. What? Why don't we stop this? Now, by now they've got so much data that they can look at. They can make a very intelligent assessment. We stop it. And after I wrote them and I said, this is what it's cost us, they stopped the program. They move on. And that's what I was trying to show you when I put that declaration on the screen, the huge amounts of data they've got in there. I had one case in which it was a identity theft question. The goods were consigned to, I think it was Dow Chemical, and it was some chemical substance. The container was flagged by customs electronically because they knew that the product that was manifested and identified on the bill of lading in that value could not be that weight. That there was a disconnect, and the container was flagged. So the real successes we've seen is the value and the use of the data. And now most of that data is given to customs before the vessel sails. It used to be given when the vessel arrived. It's made a huge difference.
Thank you. Next, Jim Blaine.
Yes. Yeah, fascinating talk. Thank you. My question is, so you've asked to be part of this, the custom track, the tracking
Yeah,
participation against, yeah, that one. You've asked the company in Finland to do a bunch of things related to their warehouse and the transport and so
Right.
forth. So how do you audit that they've actually done them? I mean, they say, oh, we did all those things.
yeah.
So how do you know?
Not only, first of all, the importer who signs on, he's on the hook. If the foreign factory doesn't do it, the importer gets dinged, and that ends the relationship if that happens. But in some of the big companies, I represent a variety of automobile companies. You submit your plan to customs and they review it. They'll come out to the company in the United States and they'll look at it. They will then send a team to the foreign factory. And woe betide the guy who says, for example, I have a 12-foot wire fence around my factory and customs gets there and there's no fence. That happens. And I had one case in which it was an automobile company. Customs went over and looked at it and they said, everything is fine, we like it. Now, show us what is the route from your factory to the dock. Put 12 vehicles on a truck and we're going to follow the truck. And they did it. They got that granular. Now, the more companies sign on, the harder that's going to be. But they have teams of customs employees who take these programs and say, we're gonna verify them.
Good.
Thank-
Yeah, auditing is critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Pate.
Yeah, I have a comment, but also a question. I have worked extensively with companies that do business in the Far East and in China in particular, engineers move jobs fairly frequently. So they'll come in and learn a process, some trade secrets, and take that to a company that they open up or to another company that pays them a little more. And that
Right.
happens all the time. It's not just the Chinese government that does that. It's a lot of individuals. So that's not something you're going to be able to stop unless pay raise there get to be significantly higher. As I remember, the CTPAT routine is often extended down through the supply chain and the suppliers to the actual exporter of record to be able to trace everything back to origin and ensure that the product is really exactly what it's indicated. Is that correct, or do I
Yes.
remember?
Yes, I mean, it is not a company by company undertaking, it is a supply chain undertaking.
Yeah.
So as I say, you go to the factory, you go to the trucking company, you go to the carrier, they all have to sign on. Now what happens is this: suppose you have a factory that says, we will agree to sign on. We'll put up the fencing. We'll do a background check on all the employees. And they do all that. And then they hire a trucking company in China, and the trucking company in China says, we're not going to do all that. We're not going to do backgrounds on our employees. We're not going to put GPS devices in our trucks. What happens then is that the company in the United States that's going to get dinged if it's not accepted into CTPAT says, okay, we'll do business with the factory in China, but we will not let you use trucking company A. That's part of our agreement. You have to use trucking company B because trucking company B has agreed to be part of that. And that's what happens. That's why you have this growth now of an amorphous value that's come up where companies will become more valuable if they've signed on, and that's helping their business. And that wasn't completely understood, frankly, by anybody when this program began.
So let me say, I'm very impressed with how thorough all the thinking is and the follow through on these things. It's really impressive. But we have actually no more hands raised at this point. I'm sure there are more people with more questions, but everybody understands that all good meetings have to come to an end.
Well,
So
let me
yeah, go ahead.
let me just give you my email. If anybody wants to send me an email, it's my email address is the letter J, Donohue, that's DONOHUE 0916 @gmail.com. If you got a question, I'll be happy to answer it.
Thanks. And we'll include that in our next blast email too. So with that, let me hand the mic back to Jim Fagan.
John,
Do the honors.
for your presentation. As is customary, we're going to forward to you a certificate of appreciation. And it has a picture of an orchid on it. And the orchid was adopted as a symbol of the old guard of Summit because Summit was the orchid capital of the East. And the old guard was founded in 1930. So we'll get that to you. And we also have at this time the old guard salute where everybody unmutes and claps.
Yay.
Hey guys, I just realized it's 11:45. I gotta go. I gotta be at another meeting at 12:05.
Thanks, John. We really appreciate it.
I didn't realize how much time I was taking. Okay, we'll stay in touch.
Okay, great.
Bye.